Have you ever wondered what would happen if you could take a complex military strategy and just fast forward to see how it plays out? Well, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to take a detailed strategic theory from 2013 about a potential strike on Iran and pit it against a fictional but totally plausible future conflict. The real question we're trying to answer is, what happens on D-Day +1, that critical moment right after the first attack?
And this quote right here from strategist Ron Tira back in 2013 is really our starting point. He made a crucial argument. A military strike isn't the end of the story. It's not the final act. It's just the opening scene. It doesn't solve the problem. It just kicks off a massive chain reaction of political and military struggles that could go on for months, maybe even years.
Okay, so first things first, let's really break down that original 2013 theory. The thinking behind it wasn't just about destroying targets. No, it was much more subtle than that. It was about creating a very specific kind of chaos, one that was designed to force Iran into a corner.
And the core concept here is something called strategic disruption. Tira's point was that blowing up centrifuges was, well, secondary. The real target was Iran's entire strategy, its super patient, carefully calculated way of pushing its nuclear program forward while trying to avoid a major war. The goal of a strike, then, was to make that whole approach completely impossible to sustain.
So how would you do that? Well, according to the theory, you had to shatter 4 key pillars. First, you've got to puncture their carefully crafted image of military might. Second, you completely disrupt their patient nuclear game. And interestingly, the third and fourth pillars were about forcing the US and Israel to finally get over their own hesitations. In essence, the strike was meant to completely break the strategic stalemate that had been going on for years.
And the way you break that stalemate is by forcing Iran into 2 impossible dilemmas, real no-win situations. First up is the retaliation dilemma. Once you're hit, who do you hit back? Do you retaliate against Israel, or do you risk a much bigger war by going after the United States? And then there's the nuclear dilemma. Do you stick to your slow and steady path, or do you make a desperate, high-stakes dash for a weapon right now? The theory was, no matter what they chose, it would be a bad choice.
So that's the theory. Now let's jump in our time machine and fast forward to our fictional reality, the 12-day war of June 2025. This is where we see how those 2013 predictions hold up when things get real.
The whole thing kicks off on June 13th with an Israeli surprise attack. And Iran's response? It's immediate, and it is massive. We're talking hundreds of missiles and drones over the next week. But then, on June 22nd, the entire game changes. The United States jumps into the fight, bombing 3 Iranian nuclear sites. A day later, Iran hits back, directly striking a U.S. base. By the 24th, it's over. A ceasefire is declared. Just 12 days of absolute, pure escalation. And make no mistake, June 22nd was the absolute turning point. The second the U.S. launched its own strikes, this wasn't just a regional fight anymore. It became a direct, head-to-head conflict between the United States and Iran. It literally transformed the entire strategic map of the Middle East overnight.
And that kind of escalation, it has a devastating human cost. The war might have been short, but it was incredibly violent. I mean, look at these numbers. In just 12 days, you're talking about thousands killed or wounded. It's a pretty stark reminder of the real-world consequences behind these high-level strategic chess moves.
All right, so now for the big comparison. How did Iran actually handle those dilemmas that were predicted way back in 2013? Did the fictional reality of 2025 line up with the theory? Let's find out.
Let's start with that retaliation dilemma. Remember, the prediction was that Iran would be forced to choose a limited strike on Israel or a super risky escalation against the US. But the reality? Oh, it was way more aggressive than that. They didn't choose one or the other. They did both. They hit Israel with everything they had, and then, the moment the US got involved, they went right after American forces. They chose maximum escalation.
So what about the nuclear dilemma? The theory said they'd have to choose, stay patient or make a mad dash for a weapon. What happened instead was just pure defiance. By early 2026, Iran was publicly claiming it had reconstructed everything, all while blocking international inspectors. And that, of course, just led to new threats of more U.S. strikes. The dilemma wasn't solved at all, it was supercharged into a whole new crisis.
You know, the war didn't just spark crises on the outside. The aftermath inside Iran was absolutely catastrophic. By early 2026, it had pushed the regime to the very brink of collapse.
12,000. Just let that number sink in. That's the estimated number of people killed by security forces during protests over just 2 nights in January 2026. The war with the outside world may have been over, but an incredibly brutal internal war was just getting started.
So what was fueling all this rage? Well, a completely shattered economy. Their currency, the rial, was basically worthless. Food price inflation was soaring above 70%. On top of that, UN sanctions had been slapped back on, choking off whatever economic life was left. People were just desperate, and that desperation was boiling over onto the street.
And this quote from a fictional U.S. Treasury Secretary, it really says it all. While ordinary people were suffering, the country's leadership was apparently wiring tens of millions of dollars out of the country. This idea that the elite were panicked, the rats fleeing a sinking ship, just poured gasoline on the fire of popular rage. It felt like the whole regime was rotting from the inside out.
And the fallout didn't stop at Iran's borders. The war absolutely hammered its power across the region. Its network of proxies, that so-called axis of resistance, was suddenly looking very vulnerable. Allies like Hamas and Hezbollah were facing huge international pressure to disarm. Iran's entire regional grand strategy was coming apart at the seams.
Okay, finally, let's zoom all the way out. This regional conflict didn't happen in a vacuum, right? It quickly became a major flashpoint in the much bigger global struggle for power, particularly between the United States and China.
You see, the 12-day war ended up being about a lot more than just Iran's nuclear program. It became a theater, a stage, for this deepening rivalry between the U.S. and China. And it put two completely different visions of how the world should work on full display.
And what a clash of strategies it was. On one hand, you had the U.S. relying on classic hard power, using its military superiority to try and force a solution. On the other hand, you had China playing the long game with soft power. They called for ceasefires, talked about diplomacy, and tried to position themselves as the mediator, all in an effort to expand their own influence without firing a single shot.
But this crisis also created a massive dilemma for China. All of a sudden, its huge Belt and Road Initiative was being threatened by the exact kind of instability it wanted to avoid. Beijing's whole story about handling crises peacefully was being tested by a real-world war. It forced them to ask a really tough question. How do you protect your global investments when your core principle is not to get involved?
Which, I think, brings us to the final big question. When you look at this whole story, from the strategic theories of 2013 to the fictional chaos of 2025, you're left wondering this. In a world that's more and more defined by this rivalry between great powers, does using overwhelming military force actually solve problems? Does it create stability? Or does it just unleash a brand new, way more unpredictable, and maybe far more dangerous kind of chaos?